if we start off with where you're at now with the different types of the developments, I suppose, around contextual and transitional safeguarding.
So I guess rather annoyingly, the first thing I'm going to do is say, oh, don't use the word model. And the reason why I'm nervous about words like model is it implies there is this sort of a static set of immutable evidence. You know, it's usually been tested in Minnesota, and then we plonk it in the middle of Wigan, and then the magic happens. And if it doesn't, of course, we can blame the practitioners or the local leaders. So I'm always a little nervous around that, and really wanting to help people, like so many colleagues working in this space, like Dr. Carleen Furman and others trying to support more effective safeguarding of young people. I think all of us are committed to trying to help people get beyond the labels, the titles of things, and more into the principles, because there's a great degree of congruence. So I did a piece of work with Carleen and with colleagues in Greater Manchester, where they have the complex safeguarding approach, this sort of hub and spoke arrangement, to try and draw out for people the very high degree of overlap and congruence between transitional, contextual and complex safeguarding. What I think we really need to avoid for practitioners and for policymakers is this idea that there are these discrete, contained models or interventions and that you have to pick one off a shelf. This is about a way of working and operating to some pretty consistent core tenets around relationship-based, trauma-informed, reflective, evidence-informed thinking. One of the things I'm particularly interested in is around boundary-spanning mindsets, which I think is particularly pertinent to contextual and to transitional safeguarding. I think that it's fair to say, certainly in my experience, that the sector have been banging this drum for some time. So you could be forgiven for thinking that all the energy around innovating for adolescents only started with Department for Education's Innovation Fund. But actually, of course, that in part was a response to the energy and appetite of local areas themselves, who'd been working for some time, catalysed in part by things like sexual exploitation, scandals and inquiries, but also beyond that. Because whilst I'm at pains to say that in terms of child protection, we're pretty good globally at keeping children safe, although there's lots of room for improvement, we have been for too long asking local services to operate within a system that was primarily designed to protect younger children from harm experienced within their family or home context. And they've had to really adapt and frankly subvert that system in order to accommodate new and emerging understandings of adolescence. So one of the things I'm particularly interested in, having harped on about adolescence for a few years, I've now in the last couple of years been really wanting to invite the sector to think more about transitional safeguarding. And again, I take no credit for this. We've just given a name to a thing that the sector has known for a very, very long time. So I don't want to suggest that I've had some bright idea that no one's ever thought of. What emerges when we talk to local areas and what came through in the literature scoping we did is this deeply binary notion we have embedded within safeguarding. So whereas other parts of the system, so special educational needs and disabilities, duties around young carers, extending support entitlements for care leavers, weird term, no one's a family leaver, are they? I digress. Whereas those parts of the system have deliberately sought to become much more fluid, much more transitional, and have had some funded duties attached accordingly, safeguarding's retained this almost uniquely binary, quite quaint idea that you can neatly delineate between childhood and adulthood, as if adolescence isn't the very process of transitioning from one state to the other. Inherent in that is quite a binary notion of victimhood and villainy. You know, there are goodies and baddies in this world, apparently. This real, I think, quite polarized understanding of capacity versus vulnerability. So transitional safeguarding is really about trying to help the sector to lean into the liminal spaces between children and adults, between safeguarding and justice, between vulnerability and capacity, to think about being needs-led rather than eligibility-led, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah, it all makes sense. It all makes sense. I suppose I wonder I kind of wonder about the whole safeguarding approach generally, actually, when you're talking about young people and the challenges that they're facing. And I don't know whether you feel, I mean, certainly my experience in the past was that local authorities would say, well, they're 14, so it doesn't come into child protection now, it's a yacht thing. And you used to have that, which was, I think, the difference between victim and villain. But you also have a tendency to, and this recently came up in a serious case review that I know about because it's in my borough, where there was a worry that actually social workers were too focused on contextual safeguarding and, ACEs and potential trauma, not actually looking at what was going on in the family and parenting issues that could have been addressed. So do you think there are risks among all of that, that even if we change the names and shift approaches, we still are at risk of falling into what you would, I think, called a binary approach?
Yeah, one of the things that I'll probably return to a lot in this conversation is this both and not either or mindset that's required. And I think you're right. I think historically there was a bit of a mindset that's quite pervasive that, that's not child protection because they're 14, 15, 16. That has certainly changed a lot over time. I think things like the quite painful increased understanding around sexual exploitation was a big driver for that. I think we were confronted with the very, very hard realization that young people facing harm in their communities, however ostensibly they might be contributing to that harm, are still children being harmed. When you get down to the brass tacks of it, child protection, like all safeguarding, it's a verb, not a noun. It's a thing we do, not a place you send citizens or a threshold to meet. And I think that's starting to really play out in the last decade or so. This idea of needing to hold both and, that young people can be both at risk and a risk, that harms might be experienced within the family and outside of the family, to me that feels absolutely the heart of a more sophisticated response to young people's needs. Both and mindsets, both victim and instigator of harms, both a child and an adult in different ways and on different days, both intra and extrafamilial drivers for their vulnerability and also for their protection, actually. So this is quite, I would say it's very nuanced work. Which I don't think has been well reflected. So I was, in preparation for this conversation, I went back to the 2019 speech that Baroness Hale gave around sort of, the advent of the Act. And of course, for very, very good reasons, back then there was a clear distinction made, some clear water, I think Lady Hale referred to it, between the processes for, delinquent or naughty children, those who were quote unquote out of control, and those who were experiencing or were at risk of experiencing abuse. So that basically, naughty young people, delinquent young people, to use the language of policymakers at the time, would be dealt with through the youth justice system, so we'd be holding them to account, whereas those experiencing abuse and neglect, of course, it's their parents that are ultimately sort of held to account, or the process designed for. And that made really good sense at its time, but I think that it raised a couple of issues. The first is, of course, it raises this notion of attribution. So that when you foreground the idea that attributing harm to parents' action or inaction is at the heart of our family justice approach, that becomes really problematic in the context of extrafamilial harm, where a parent might be doing their absolute damnedest but undermined by some pretty sophisticated, organised efforts by abusers. But I think it also has highlighted that for all the good reasons we kept youth justice and family justice very distinct, the emerging and increasing understanding of extrafamilial harm, things like community-based violence, criminal exploitation, county lines, sexual exploitation, things like that, peer-on-peer abuse, really highlights that there isn't such a neat delineation to be made. And I think that's quite an important part of any redesign work. I would also suggest personally that this desire to separate, the naughty from the needy, to put it a little crudely, it's a bit of a risk, I think, reflected in things like the way government departments are organised. We have an awful lot of different government departments leading on different but very overlapping agendas. So, the Home Office, for example, taking a lead role around things like criminal exploitation, county lines, and increasingly now domestic abuse, of course, and indeed child sexual abuse. I think that's quite tricky then when you have different elements of a young person's life split across multiple departments and all those divergent policy agendas. I also think there's a bit of a dissonance that emerges here because, well, I'll be blunt. How can local services square the government emphasis on behaviour and the huge variance we have between educational settings in how they manage behaviour, how they do exclusions, how they do off-rolling? How do you square that then with the emerging concern that exclusion can be a risk of exploitation? How do you, as a local leader, navigate the fact that on the one hand, evidence increasingly suggests we need to be much more equalities and diversity aware in our safeguarding work, when other quarters of government are having what I believe is called a war on woke? These are quite difficult circles to square, aren't they? So you see this kind of fragmentation in discourse, in policy, and sometimes even in legislation. And I think that drives a degree of fragmentation at local level. So although, local partnerships work very hard to operate with some degree of coherence, when you've got different services or forces working to different policy imperatives, different performance indicators, different inspection frameworks, different funding formulas, I think that makes it very difficult to role model and enable the kind of coherent team around the child approach that we know multifaceted young people need. That was a bit of a rant. I hope that made sense.
It made very good sense. Yeah, it's very helpful. Just to go back to what you think works across these not models, but ways of approaching young people and their problems. You talked about trauma-informed, relationship-based, which we know works for adults as well, different settings. And I'm just thinking about how you think we could better deal with those children who we think anecdotally are ending up now in the courts in the family justice sector in care proceedings, and because people want effectively to lock them up in order to protect them from the harm, the contextual harm from gangs, from all the rest of it. So, and I think, two questions really. Do you think there are circumstances in which children do need that level of protection at times, just to, give them a moment to sort of be able to think about how they might do things differently themselves? And how do you think we can best really help those kids move on, those young people move on from the circumstances in which they've got themselves?
Okay, I'm going to draw a distinction, I think, here between the kinds of practice that approaches like contextual safeguarding and transitional safeguarding suggest and advise, and the system pressures and barriers that are meaning that we're not always meeting these young people's needs, because I do think they're different issues to an extent. So if we take, for example, the use of secure, often out-of-area placements for young people facing harm, even in our language there, might it help them do different things or make better choices, I sometimes hear. Well, we need to ask whether the tool is fit for the job. If the job in hand is Mary's not safe in the middle of Wandsworth because there are organised groups targeting her and her family and she's ensnared in drug debt bondage, and that puts her at a high degree of risk in her life, we could put her in a very expensive placement somewhere near Snowdonia, 15 grand a week, 5-to-1 supervision, couldn't we? And that would keep her physically safe in the moment. But what it doesn't do is actually address the source of risk and harm. So I'm often minded of Lucy Shuker's work around physical security being one element of the triangle, but you've got relational security and psychological security. When we place you somewhere near Snowdonia at great expense, we've dealt with one aspect. We could even be undermining the other two. So when you start to approach 18 and adult services take one look at the bill and say, hasn't Mary got capacity? And quite reasonably bring you back to the middle of Wandsworth or Weymouth or Wigan or wherever you are, all those harms may still be intact in your community. The people who sought you out, the people you owed money to, the groups in which you were either being pulled towards or pushed towards may well still exist, likely will still exist in some form. But of course, now you have no friends, no trusted professional. We could have actually made you more vulnerable to the approaches of those who would seek to harm you in our effort to protect you. So again, this is quite nuanced both and thinking required. And, and there's a multitude of issues associated with that. Commissioning approaches, the marketisation and privatisation within our settings and that the services available, the commodification of risk. My personal view is that some rather unscrupulous commercial providers add a zero depending on how worried you sound when you're looking for a bed. I think there is a commodification of children's vulnerability that can happen here, and we could do an awful lot more to address that. I believe in France, they have an element of legislation that says you must not profit from a child in danger. And I sometimes wonder whether for our local authority colleagues, we've made it almost impossible for them not to allow someone else to profit from a child in danger through the market kind of mindset and paradigm that we have. So all of those things are really relevant. I also think that resourcing and austerity is relevant here. We have fewer and fewer tools available to local areas, or certainly that's what comes through in the research done with local areas. And I guess when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If all you've got left is sharp-end child protection and the family courts, you will squeeze whatever issues you're trying to address into that hole. And I think that there are real implications here for things like commensurate funding for any duty around early help. for example, that there has been a missed opportunity so far in this country. So all of those structural and systemic features, I think, matter. But to the first part of your question around the kind of practices and approaches that we believe, based on the best available evidence, seems to be more effective. And I'm being careful not to use the term what works, because I'm very influenced by Professor Eileen Munro's challenge back. She gave it again recently. It's not what works, it's what works for whom, under what circumstances, we think. And I would say that an awful lot of what matters can't be proven to work, but it still matters. And that raises huge evidential challenges, of course, for colleagues doing evaluative work. The kinds of things that the evidence suggests so far seem to be central to effective and ethical work with young people, because I do think effective and ethical need to be seen as two sides of the same coin. We know that relational or relationship-based practice is important, and that doesn't just mean being pals, of course, but that sort of that deep sense that the relationship is both the vehicle for an intervention and in some instances may be the intervention in its own right, that bringing of yourself to work, that combining the use of intuition alongside using good evidence in terms of how we operate. I think it requires a high degree of reflection and emotional containment from practitioners, and that has implications for supervision. We would suggest that a developmentally attuned approach, just like we did in early years, where we actually use the evidence about infant development and infant attachment to design what we should be doing in early years. We've never actually done that for teenagers, which is astonishing, really. You can't run an early years setting without having a grounding in child development, but we'll let you go and work with teenagers any day of the week. And I find that really quite astonishing. Never mind how little we draw on the evidence around emerging adulthood and those developmental specificities. So being developmentally attuned, being relational in our work, of course, being evidence informed, which is part of it. I think that participatory practice is key. I increasingly think that language like keep young people safe is a nonsense. We don't keep anything. We help young people to play a part in being safe in their worlds. And that is a scary thought, isn't it, when we're used to protecting? So that really enabling participatory approach, which is much more embedded in adult safeguarding, really rights-based, person-centered approaches. We could really do with drawing some of that down into our work with teenagers, particularly those aged 16 and over, who, of course, are assumed to have capacity under the Mental Capacity Act. You wouldn't know it sometimes to look at our safeguarding practice. And I would say, crucially, this is about systemic work. So that really links the contextual stuff that Carleen leads on. We all of us, I'm a complete Bronfenbrenner disciple. We are made up of our experiences and environments, and we exist in systems. So locating our intervention, ACEs, for example, on what this kid and his mum do or don't do is missing 90% of the factors that influence, that child's life.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's all very important. Wonderful to hear Bronfenbrenner suddenly pop up again. That's long time.
I'm old-fashioned like that. I like my public services democratically accountable as well, if we're, going to get out of date.
So, given all of that, and you've talked about the challenge of the structures within which people are working, do you think would it be a good idea to develop some completely new service for adolescents, for young people, or can we work with what we've got?
I'm very nervous of the idea that the solution to anything is a service. I don't think all support is a service, and I actually think that I started my career, or a lot of my practice work anyway, in youth offending, and so perhaps that influences my thinking here. Youth offending teams were supposed to be a boundary-spanning, connective tissue, multidisciplinary entity, and over time, some have observed, and I have sympathy with this, that they've become another silo between which young people fall. I think that this issue of really effective adolescent and transitional safeguarding is about systems leadership. You want a system, not a service. As soon as you talk services, you've made another couple of cliff edges on the way in and on the way out. You've immediately got to start having criteria. It's only for 10 to 14-year-olds or 14 to 18-year-olds, or it's only for this postcode. You're into throughput and caseload and all that threshold stuff, which I think has been getting in the way of good boundary-spanning, needs-led approaches. So I'm very nervous of the idea that a service will fix it, which is not to say that there aren't some brilliant services who've got a huge amount to offer this agenda. I suspect that we might need to start, before trying to tinker with local services, taking a real step back, getting off the dance floor and onto the balcony, as Heifetz would say, and look at the wider context in which we're trying to do this transformation work. Some of the problems we face are about, policy fragmentation, possibly even about legislation, but some of it's deeper than that. It's a kind of deeply entrenched psychosocial perspective on teenagers. I don't think we like teenagers very much in this country. We spend all of our adult lives wearing anti-wrinkle cream and control pants to try and be teenagers again, but we actually treat them appallingly. We have some sanctions that only apply to you if you're a teenager. Imagine any other group. Imagine having antisocial behaviour measures that only apply to particular communities. It's an extraordinary thing, really, to think about. And I think that we also need to start having some quite grown-up conversations about the extraordinary dissonance in how we understand adolescents' responsibilities, capacities, freedoms and rights. So, we have an age of criminal responsibility in England of the age of 10. So we believe you to be able to make choices, informed choices, and bear the consequences of these choices at the age of 10. But you can't vote till you're 18 in case you don't understand the consequences of your choices. You can apply to join the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force as long as you've got parental consent at the age of 15. You can serve from 16, but you can't get a tattoo till you're 18. Whilst you're alive, you can consent to any medical treatment as long as you're deemed to understand the implications, under Gillett competency, but you can't donate your organs if dead without your parental consent until you're 18. At 16, you can engage in sexual behaviours that you're not allowed to watch on film. The idiosyncrasies, I think, are really, really, really stark. So there is a bit of a, let's think about how we think about teenagers rather than tell local authorities to make a new shiny service. Let's have an honest conversation as a nation about that stuff. What I do think is important in terms of service design is you're looking at what I've been really inspired by in local areas is those places where they are really aiming for congruence between the offer they're making young people and families and the way they design the offer. So if you say you want trauma-informed practice approaches in your offer, designing that service or that system or that offer in a way which is ethical, inclusive, engages people at their own pace. If you say you want participative young person-centered practice, you best have young people on your design group as well. You best have young people helping you to evaluate the service, helping you to recruit to the service. So really looking to walk the talk in terms of how they make the offer, not just what the offer is. I think that's really, really key. I find that very impressive in many local areas.
Mm-hmm. And I think you've talked about the importance of supervision and support, this relationship-based approach and understanding of child development, which, I would entirely agree with. But I think sometimes, or my experience of youth services in the past was sometimes that they didn't seem to really have that. There was a bit of an element of, good relationships with young people, but more of a kind of matey relationship and therefore a reluctance sometimes to tackle some of the issues. And how do you think do you see that being dealt with well in areas where you think there's good practice? Is there
I think you're right. I think historically, a bit like your kind of reflection there around how child protection services used to say, well, that's not us because they're teenagers. And I think historically that was very true of youth work as well. We do young person centred, so we actually don't engage in safeguarding or challenge. And I think that's absolutely changing. I think there's more and more sophisticated and nuanced approaches coming through. But I certainly agree that we have some issues around workforce, resilience, support, learning and development, because I've deliberately tried not to bang on about funding. Take it as read. I think we need to have better, more commensurate funding that's in accordance with the 89 Act and based on need. But it's not the only resource we need. We need to make sure we've got the requisite emotional and intellectual resource available. And I think that in part speaks to, are we attracting and retaining the right people for the right reasons? It's quite often made clear to me when I ask colleagues, particularly I think colleagues working in things like social care, family support, early help, why do you do the job you do? I came into this to protect vulnerable children. Well, that's great, except that we're now asking you to protect people in a way that doesn't disempower them when they don't identify as children and don't identify as vulnerable. It's a different emotional ask on people. And I think that the other thing that's really, really key is this is scary work. It's scary for politicians. You can hear that when they talk about it in the press. It's very scary for practitioners and their managers. And so I think that does a couple of things. One, it pushes us to think about what is the support, the reflective, relational, ethical support required to help people practice in a reflective, relational, ethical way. I think Personally, it's totally indefensible that only some professional groups are required to have access to reflective supervision. I think partnership working should require us all to think about what's the whole area offer. I think people like early help workers, some schools colleagues, youth service colleagues are often doing some very, very complex, quite messy interface work, often rooted in communities. They often live in the communities they work in, so there could be conflicts of interest or some trickiness for them, and yet they're very often not given the kind of supervision that social workers and allied health professionals get. And I think any multi-agency partnership worth its salt should be asking about equity of access to that kind of support. I also think that there's rather a focus on training as a mechanism for change rather than learning. Not all learning is training. In fact, the most effective learning might not be traditional training. And so those local areas that I've seen where they're doing skills exchange, group supervision, multi-agency case clinics, skills swaps, co-working, peer observation, that to me feels like a really rich and strengths-based way of bringing practitioners into the design challenge, getting them to share their talents and skills and knowledge and build the capacity of the whole local area rather than let's get Mary and Des in to do some training for a day. And I think that's a much more strengths-based way of working. And of course, if we want strengths-based practice with kids, we do need to treat our staff in a strengths-based way. And ideally, we'd be wanting to treat local leaders in a strengths-based way as well.
Yeah, okay, that's very helpful. What about, if we just briefly on the courts before we move on to the horizon? So we've got two systems. You go down youth justice, increasingly fewer, or there's care proceedings, seemingly growing number of adolescents. What's your view about that kind of approach? Should we be developing different sorts of court models for young people? What's your view about that?
I certainly think that if we were starting from scratch now, knowing what we know about adolescent development, knowing what we know about extrafamilial harm, would we design the thing we've got? And I suspect the answer is no. And that's sometimes the only impetus you need to start some bold redesign work, isn't it? I've been much taken and impressed by some of the learning from things like FDAC, Family Drug and Alcohol Court. I think some of those key findings around, if you like, relationship-based court work, judges holding cases, meeting the same people over time, building that sense of, mutual understanding of each other. What if we had an FDAC model for extrafamilial harm? What could we learn from those innovations that would speak to this tricky issue? What can we learn, for example, from the Court of Protection, working with adults, that might have implications for how we manage things like out-of-area and secure placements? That very, very heavy focus on rights and avoiding over-intervention. I'm really struck actually by the dissonance in the court system. You'll know this very well, Mary. So that famous judgment where Mumdy said in relation to adults that he was presiding over a decision in their lives, and he said, what use is it making someone safe if we only make them miserable? I'm cherry picking the particular line from a much richer, more nuanced judgment. And that expression is used consistently in adult services. I hear it all the time from colleagues working to safeguard adults and working in that arena. Put really bluntly, I think we're very relaxed about making people under 18 miserable as long as they're physically safe. There's a very, very stark disjunct between the way in which the legal systems operate to safeguard those over and under 18, even though the only distinction that you can point to is their birthday. Their trauma doesn't change, their brain's still developing, everything else around them stays the same, but they have the audacity to turn 18 and suddenly they're treated as a different species. And I think that is worth attending to. I also think that we've been very fortunate that the Department for Education have invested in the Social Care Innovation Programme for a number of years. I think that's enabled lots of local areas to really flex their muscles. I think it'd be really exciting to think about a cross-governmental innovation fund, which was deliberately aimed at funding innovation in the interface, in the intersections, in the liminal spaces between arenas. That would seem to me to be more fruitful than innovation within silos. Yep. And I would also suggest that we probably, just as practitioners working in that kind of safety and care space need better legal literacy, I suspect that our colleagues who are very skilled in the legal matters need a bit more support to become literate around things like adolescent development, the impact of trauma and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's very helpful. What do you see coming along, Des, in this area? Can you see new developments online? Can you see a spreading of the good practice that you've been involved in? What do you think is facing us in coming years, good and bad, I would say?
I think there's an enormous amount of challenge facing us. I think that funding is often something that people focus on, and it is an issue, but I think there are other threats facing us. I'm increasingly concerned about this sort of unholy triumvirate of disinformation, polarization, and conspiracy that is evident in our political, policy, press, and public discourse. And I don't believe that those three forces enable nuanced, thoughtful, ethical, responsive rather than reactive approaches. So I think that's a bit of a meta threat to us all actually trying to do sensible work in this space. I'm very concerned that we're apparently tired of experts and don't care about facts, because I think expertise and factual evidence is one of the most powerful levers we have for good quality innovation in this space. I think that what's been incredibly heartening, though, is that for all the challenges facing the sector, they've done what they always do, which is turn it into an opportunity. So for all the horrors of, oh my God, we have to do online working, how will we possibly do that? The benefits in terms of greater digital literacy professionals, professionals who now know how to work online are likely to be much more confident or able to have discussions about online safety, for example. It increases access, so on and so forth. I also think when we're working with dozens and dozens of local authority areas now in safeguarding partnerships who are really interested in transitional safeguarding. And I take great heart from that, because the work they're doing, the drive they've got, there's no money, no one's given extra funding for this. They're dealing with a pandemic. We would all have forgiven them for saying, ooh, not yet, thanks, come back in 2025. And they haven't, all around the country, from authorities considered to be outstanding to safeguarding partnerships who are newly formed, those facing a challenge, the ambition to do better and do right by citizens, if anything, I think has been strengthened. I think there is a transformational undertone, certainly, around the very nature of the relationship between the state and the citizen. I personally choose not to leverage that argument to say austerity is a good thing, because I don't believe it is in many, many ways. But I do think this idea of reconceptualizing the citizen, rather than being passive recipients of bin collection and social care, but actually active agents in our own lives, in our communities. I think that an emphasis on citizenship, co-production, collaboration, I think is quite important. I see councils up and down the country recalibrating their relationship with partners and with residents. For me, there's a mirroring there, just like the best professionals are walking a careful line with a young person, taking a bit of a risk, sharing some power, relinquishing some power, not assuming they know best. That to me is being role modeled by, in the best places, that very same conversation happening at council level. How do we step back, share power, recognize that the responsibility is with us and we're scared, but that we can't run everything. I think that's quite an important trend that's coming through again and again. I also think that we're seeing increasing emphasis both at national and local level around the use of data. And I feel a bit conflicted on this. Having spent 10, 20 years saying we need better data, better research, I'm now saying, oh, but if it's not ethical, it's not better. So just gathering more data, I think, is a fool's errand. And I think the reason why we need to think quite carefully about data is because there are two big sort of narratives that sometimes get framed as this sort of silver bullet: the public health approach, which is going to fix everything, and algorithms, data modeling, which is also, if you believe some commentators, going to fix everything. Both of those approaches rely on high quality data, which we do not have. We don't have that data. And when we think about the individual, the kids we're talking about here, let's put it really bluntly. Do you want your son's name ending up on a spreadsheet because he's mates with someone who's mates with someone who's mates with someone who got picked up with a knife? And if he ends up on that spreadsheet, do you get told about it? What are your rights in terms of GDPR? Can you be forced to give your consent to use it? All of these implications. And we do need policymakers and people who are striving to enable better data to just pause, to think about what it means for children and families and communities, because simply introducing, new duties to capture how many young people are at risk of county lines in your area will define at risk. We could end up with some quite distorted data and ultimately not very helpful data. And at worst, we could increase vulnerabilities for, and we could certainly, I think, increase harms for minoritized communities who are already themselves, identified as disproportionately represented in things like justice data. So I think that the whole data trend is one to keep a careful eye on.
Mm-hmm. That's good point. Helpful. Finally, on a kind of vision, if you were to be in control and able to change the world, what would be your vision about how we would deal with difficult situations for kids, helping them to develop their own responses and ways of coping?
So I've laughed out loud at the idea of being in control. I'm barely in control of myself at the moment. I think for me, this is really about boundary spanning. Williams defines boundary spanning as this reaching across borders, margins, or sections to build relationships, interconnections, and interdependencies in order to manage complex problems. And for me, that in a nutshell is the approach needed here. We really need to create space so that local leaders and individual practitioners can get into the spaces, the liminal spaces between the silos. That's where the magic happens. So spanning childhood and adulthood, taking into account the evidence around development and emerging adulthood. I think it's really notable that the United Nations define youth as 14 to 25, not 11 and a half to 17 and a half. That's service language. It's not actually evidence informed. Allowing space to span dual identities, spanning intrafamilial and extrafamilial harm, spanning service agencies, not fragmenting young people. So, you see Mary for your issue with gangs, and you see Des for your school attendance, and Matt's the only person who's ever met your dad because he works in probation. This sort of this splitting, actually, of young people, I think, is deeply unhelpful. For me, this is about systems leadership in its truest sense. So true boundary spanning systems leadership. I'm rather of a view that when they introduced total place and then community budgets, had we pursued that, we wouldn't be having this conversation, Mary, because as soon as local leaders had a whole place perspective on expenditure, interdependencies and consequences, the business case writes itself. We know that the really interconnected nature of harms facing young people demands a really integrated system of support. Homelessness drives exploitation, drives homelessness. Poverty drives health outcomes, drives poverty outcomes. So thinking in that very, very systemic way, to me, suggests that having complexity attuned commissioning, true systems leadership, whole government working. I'm old fashioned, I'm afraid. So I think a department with a really clear, all encompassing focus on children, young people and the families in which they exist is more helpful to the public purse and to citizens. And I think that there's something here about the value we place on the work. I don't believe we value teenagers in our country, and I think that plays out then in how we value the workforce that serves them. And I would like to see far greater esteem and kudos actually afforded to those who do this very, very skilled, very highly scrutinized, very emotionally and intellectually demanding and done well, very, very nuanced work with young people. So my vision would be a system that really, really recognizes that. And when we talk about, when I work with local areas around safeguarding young people into adulthood, we talk about these kind of 6 key fundamental principles. Is it evidence informed? And by that, we don't just mean, is there an RCT? We mean, are you drawing on rich, relevant, robust research, data, lived experience, practice, wisdom? Is it contextual or ecological? Are you seeing the systems that make us all up, and make who we are? Thirdly, is it transitional or developmental? Does it do what we know this developmental stage asks of us? Fourthly, is it relational? Because that's what makes a difference. We know that again and again and again. The quality and calibre of that relational working. Fifth, does it attend to and actively disrupt issues around equalities, diversity and inclusion? Because we are not doing that well enough in our work with young people, particularly. And then lastly, like a stick of rock all the way through it, is it participative? Have we made this with you, not for you? And does that then lead to practice, which is with you, not to you? I'm a bit shy of saying that's my vision. That's my learning to date. I think that would be a good starting point. And in many local areas, they've gone beyond that starting point, and credit to them, really. I've thought of another thing there. You said, what would I do if I was in control? I've thought of an actual thing. If I was in charge for a day, I would introduce a system of quality assurance, a bit like the JTI, the Joint Targeted Area Inspection. So the things that we measure the team around the child on, collaboration, shared vision, accountability to each other, we should also be using to measure the effectiveness of government departments. I think we should be holding intergovernment leaders to exactly the same standards of collaborative, boundary-spanning, child-centred approaches that we hold individual practitioners, because it cannot be right that we expect more of your average school nurse, sexual health nurse, Senko and social worker than we do of our secretaries of state. I tend to think that the magic and sometimes the real mess happens in the space between stuff, whether it's the space between a young person and their parent, whether it's the space between government departments, the space between services, the space between your inspection framework versus mine. That's where you can do the best magic, but it's also where the madness can occur. So I think focusing our energy on the gaps, the spaces, the bridges between, rather than the stuff. I think what we do too much of is popping things into boxes, whether it's needs. Oh, well, you're a gangs case, not a neglect case. Oh, well, you're a social worker, not a youth participation worker. We do an awful lot of delineation, disaggregation, and not enough what's the space in between, what are the commonalities we can draw. And I think in part that's driven by things like funding and policy, quite short-termist side of thing. But I also think it makes us feel safe, because when you can point to a thing and its edges, this is the policing strategy, this is county lines, this is extrafamilial harm, this is the family justice system, that makes us feel safe. I can show you where the fences are. I can probably tell you what good looks like, all those nice reassuring things that we like to talk about. Whereas when you start talking about systems and spaces and smudging and dynamic volatility and uncertainty and complexity and situational notions of resilience versus capacity, all of a sudden I have to let go with one hand. I have to be on the current. It moves me, I don't control it. And I think that's quite unsettling for us, actually, whether we are the Secretary of State or a youth worker trying to do their best for a kid. I think it's really quite unnerving. And we tend to do that which alleviates discomfort. If I'm feeling scared, I'll try and create a sense of I'm in control. When things feel uncertain, I'll try and impose order. It's why we use totally flawed risk assessment toolkits. I have to do something. Maybe scoring this kid will make me feel safer, and then my boss will feel safer, and the inspectors can check how many authorities are using the checklist. Everyone's safer apart from the kid. And I think that, to me, that is an emotional issue. And like so much of this work, the problems and the solutions are often emotional and relational and situational, but all of our attention goes on the transactional. Does that make any sense at all? Mary knows me well enough to shut up at this point if I know.
What's so lovely is that there was so much truth in there, that I can see some cliches being born out of that. I'm joking. That was meant to be a good thing. I love cliches because there's truth in there, Okay.
All right.
And there was a few in the bits before. Forgive me, I'm going to be obtuse now, but I really loved so many things you've made the point on, and that's enough for I think you've just given us so much.
Great. Well, it was incredibly cathartic for me, I have to say.